The air inside the Vatican's apostolic palace is thick with incense and the weight of silence. It is May 1605, and in the Sistine Chapel, 70 cardinals sit cloistered behind locked doors, their breaths held in the stifling Roman heat. For weeks, they have deadlocked, factions clashing like rams in the night, unable to name the next vicar of Christ. Outside, the city of Rome simmers, its future a prisoner to the smoke rising from a copper stove. A young cardinal, only 26 years old, paces the marble floor of an antechamber. His name is Camillo Borghese. His hands, soft from a life of privilege, are clenched into fists at his sides. He is not a candidate, he is the nephew of a cardinal who is a candidate. But in this moment, as he listens to the whispered alliances shifting behind the tapestry-hung walls, he understands a fundamental truth that will define his family for generations. In the game of papal power, the throne is not won by the most pious, but by the most cunning architect. The door creaks open, and a beam of candlelight cuts across his face, illuminating the glint of cold ambition in his eyes. A servant whispers a single name. In that instant, the Borghese family's long, audacious quest to seize immortality begins. To understand the empire of marble they carved into the soul of Rome, we must first step into the shadows of the conclave, where they forged their destiny. The road from Siena to Rome in the autumn of 1559 was not a road for the faint of heart. It was a ribbon of rutted earth, cut through the spine of Italy, where bandits lurked in the cypress groves and the wolves of the Maremma came down to the passes when the moon was thin. Along this road, a man named Marcantonio Borghese rode, with a chest of silver strapped to his mule and a secret burning in his chest. By day, he was a respected law professor at the University of Siena, a man who lectured on the fine points of Roman civil law to the sons of the Tuscan elite. By night, in the candlelit solitude of his study, he traced the family trees of cardinals and plotted a future that most men would call madness. He was not a noble. His family had made its fortune in the wool trade, and then in the law, solid, respectable, but profoundly ordinary in a land where bloodlines stretched back to emperors. Siena itself was a fallen city, humbled by its ancient rival Florence, its golden age reduced to bitter memories and crumbling palazzos. Marcantonio looked at his three sons and saw that there was no future for them here, in a provincial backwater, teaching law to the sons of merchants. He saw only one path that could lift the Borghese name from the dust of the lecture hall to the marble of the Vatican. The papacy, not the throne itself, that was a dream too distant for even his ambition to grasp. But the men who surrounded the Pope, the cardinals who advised him, who controlled the Leviathan bureaucracy of the Church, they were princes. They commanded armies, taxed nations, and built palaces that would outlast kingdoms. And a cardinal's red hat, Marcantonio had learned, could be bought. Not with a bribe in a dark alley, but with a lifetime of service, of alliances, of strategic marriages, and most of all, with money. The Church in the 16th century ran on gold, and the families who provided that gold were rewarded with power. So he sold land, he mortgaged the future. He took the silver that should have been his son's inheritance and placed it in the hands of a Sienese banker who had connections to the papal court. The banker looked at the chest, weighed the coins with a practiced hand, and asked what favor Marcantonio sought. Marcantonio answered with two words, a cardinal's hat. Not for himself, he was too old, too provincial for his son. The banker laughed, but he took the silver. That was the way of Rome. Everyone laughed until the money changed hands, and then the laughter stopped. The son destined for this gamble was the second-born, Camillo. The firstborn, Francesco, would inherit what remained of the family lands and continue the Sienese line. But Camillo, the quiet one with the sharp eyes and the memory that never forgot a face or a slight, he was the one Marcantonio shaped for Rome. While other boys learned to ride and hunt, Camillo learned canon law. While other young men courted the daughters of Sienese merchants, Camillo was sent to Perugia to study theology, then to Padua to polish his Latin. His father wrote him letters filled with instructions: be pious, but let men see your piety. Be learned, but never make a man feel your superior. Remember that in Rome, the man who controls the Pope's ear controls the world. In 1560, the investment paid its first dividend. Pope Pius IV, a man who owed his own elevation to the shrewd management of his family, was looking for reliable administrators. The Sienese connection opened the door, and Camillo Borghese, barely past his 30th year, was appointed a consistorial advocate, a position that placed him in the gears of the papal legal machine. It was not a cardinal's hat, it was not even a bishopric, but it was a foothold. Marcantonio, who had not lived to see the appointment, died the same year, and Camillo stood at his father's grave in the Sienese church of San Francesco, watching the earth cover the man who had gambled everything. He made a silent promise that the silver would not be wasted. The years that followed were years of patience. Camillo did not race for power. He built it, brick by brick, relationship by relationship. He served in the papal courts with such diligence that his superiors took notice. He was sent as a legate to Spain, where he impressed King Philip II with his knowledge of church law and his unruffled calm under the pressure of royal demands. When he returned to Rome, he carried with him letters of recommendation that opened new doors. In 1570, he was appointed vice-legate of Bologna, one of the most important cities in the Papal States. The position came with a salary, a palace, and most importantly, visibility. The cardinals in Rome began to know his name. He did not forget his father's strategy. Every florin he earned, he saved. Every favor he received, he recorded in a small ledger that he kept locked in his study. He cultivated friendships with the powerful, but never at the expense of the humble. He built a reputation as a man of integrity, a man who could be trusted with secrets. And all the while, he watched the papacies come and go, Pius V, Gregory XIII, Sixtus V, each new pope bringing a new set of favorites, a new constellation of power. Camillo waited. In 1590, his patience was rewarded. Pope Gregory XIV, a Milanese with few reliable allies in Rome, needed men of proven competence to fill the ranks of the Curia. Camillo Borghese's name was presented, his dossier impeccable, his loyalty unquestioned. On the 5th of December, 1590, he received the summons that changed his family's history. He was to be made a cardinal. The ceremony took place in the consistory hall of the Vatican, beneath the frescoes of the early popes. Camillo knelt before Gregory XIV, and the pope placed the scarlet hat upon his head, pronouncing the ancient words that made a man a prince of the church. Camillo rose from his knees with his face composed, his eyes betraying nothing. But in his mind, he heard his father's voice, the whisper from the study in Siena, "In Rome, we will be princes." Now the second phase of the gamble could begin. For a cardinal's hat was not an end, it was a beginning. And Camillo Borghese had a nephew who would carry the family's ambition further than Marcantonio ever dreamed. The boy who would become the true engine of the Borghese dynasty entered the world not in a palace, but in a modest house in the Roman Rione of Campo Marzio. His name was Scipione Caffarelli, and his father, Francesco, was a minor noble with more pride than property. His mother, Hortensia, was Camillo Borghese's sister, the link that bound the Caffarelli name to the rising star of the Borghese. When Scipione was only a child, both his parents died, leaving him an orphan in a city that devoured the weak. He might have faded into the anonymous ranks of Rome's impoverished gentry, a footnote in a parish ledger, had his uncle not looked upon him and seen raw material for greatness. Camillo Borghese, now a cardinal with a growing household and a reputation for cold calculation, saw something in the orphan nephew that others missed. The boy was not soft. He had been tested by loss and had emerged with a core of steel wrapped in a charming exterior. He learned quickly, adapted faster, and possessed a quality that Camillo valued above all others: absolute loyalty, forged in the knowledge that his uncle was his only path to survival. Camillo took Scipione into his household, gave him tutors, and began to shape him as Marcantonio had once shaped Camillo. But there was a difference. Marcantonio had dreamed of a cardinal's hat. Camillo dreamed of something larger, a Borghese pope and a Borghese prince who would rule Rome not from the Vatican's throne, but from the shadows behind it. The years of preparation were patient and deliberate. Scipione was sent to study law at the University of Perugia, the same institution that had polished Camillo's own credentials. He was taught to speak with the measured cadence of a diplomat, to move through the corridors of power with the grace of a born courtier, and to understand the fundamental currency of papal Rome: information. Every whisper, every alliance, every grudge held by a cardinal or a noble house was a coin to be spent. Camillo drilled into his nephew the lesson he had learned from his own father: power in Rome does not come to those who shout the loudest. It comes to those who wait, who listen, and who strike when the moment is right. By the time Scipione reached his early 20s, he was already a fixture in his uncle's inner circle. He carried messages that could not be trusted to servants. He sat in on meetings where the fate of bishoprics and governorships was decided. He learned to read the faces of cardinals as other men read books: the twitch of a lip that betrayed ambition, the sudden stillness that signaled a secret held. And he learned the geography of Rome's power, the palazzos and churches where alliances were made and broken over cups of wine and murmured promises. In 1605, the moment arrived. Pope Clement VII, who had reigned for 13 years and had done much to stabilize the papacy after the turbulent decades of the Counter-Reformation, died on the 3rd of March. Rome immediately plunged into the frantic, secretive chaos that accompanied every conclave. The cardinals, 70 of them, sealed themselves within the apostolic palace, their windows bricked shut, their food passed through a turnstile, their every conversation subject to the scrutiny of rival factions. Outside, the Roman populace watched the chimney of the Sistine Chapel with a mixture of dread and hope, reading the smoke for signs of divine intervention. Camillo Borghese entered the conclave as a candidate, but not a favorite. The factions were divided between the French party, backed by King Henry IV, and the Spanish party, supported by the Habsburgs. The two great powers of Europe had spent generations battling for influence over the papacy, and the conclave became their battlefield. For weeks, the cardinals deadlocked. One candidate after another rose and fell, vetoed by one crown or the other, their supporters unable to muster the two-thirds majority required. The Roman heat built with the tension, and the cardinals, many of them elderly and exhausted, began to look for a compromise, a man acceptable to both France and Spain, a man who would not tilt the balance of European power too far in either direction. Camillo Borghese was such a man. He had served under several popes without making enemies of either major power. He had cultivated a reputation for piety and competence that crossed factional lines, and he had, over the years, quietly built a network of allies who owed him favors, men who had been appointed to bishoprics or given positions in the curia because Camillo had whispered their names in the right ears. Now, those debts came due. Scipione waited outside the conclave walls, in the apartments his uncle had secured near St. Peter's. He paced the marble floors, his fingers tracing the edges of a rosary, his mind racing through the calculations that would determine his family's future. He received reports from servants and low-level clerics who carried messages from cardinals inside, a nod here, a raised eyebrow there, a faction shifting its weight. He sent back instructions, his handwriting a neat, controlled script that belied the urgency of the moment. When a cardinal wavered, Scipione dispatched a messenger with a promise or a warning, whichever the situation required. On the 16th of May, the 63rd day of the conclave, the smoke finally turned white. The cannon of Castel Sant'Angelo roared its announcement across the city, and the crowds that had gathered in St. Peter's Square erupted in cheers and tears. Camillo Borghese had been elected pope. He took the name Paul V, honoring the apostle who had carried the faith to the ends of the Roman Empire. But in the antechamber of the apostolic palace, it was Scipione Borghese, for he had taken his uncle's surname upon the election, severing his connection to the Caffarelli name, who allowed himself a smile that did not reach his eyes. The game, he knew, had only begun. The elevation of a pope was not the final victory. It was the moment when a family's true test began. For the new pope, now the vicar of Christ, the supreme authority of the Catholic Church, was expected to renounce worldly ambition, to place the good of the Church above the interests of his blood. Every pope in living memory had ignored that expectation, and Scipione intended to ensure that Paul V would not be the first to break the pattern. The first weeks of Paul V's papacy were a whirlwind of ceremony, consolidation, and calculation. The new pope moved through the rituals of his office with a solemnity that seemed to fit his ascetic features and his reputation for piety. He processed through the streets of Rome on the feast of Corpus Domini, the blessed sacrament held high beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, while the crowds that had been uncertain of their new pontiff fell to their knees in genuine reverence. He received the ambassadors of France and Spain with a diplomatic evenness that promised stability after the long interregnum. He appointed the members of the Curia with a careful hand, rewarding loyalty without alienating the powerful families who had supported his rivals. To all appearances, Paul V was the compromise pope the cardinals had sought, a man who would govern with moderation and devote himself to the spiritual renewal of the Church. But behind the closed doors of the apostolic palace, a different story was unfolding. Scipione Borghese, now 26 years old, had been elevated to the position of cardinal nephew within days of his uncle's election. The title carried no formal constitutional authority, but in practice, it was the second most powerful office in Christendom. The cardinal nephew served as the Pope's Secretary of State, his gatekeeper, his memory, and often his conscience. All correspondence with the papal court passed through the cardinal nephew's hands. All audiences with the pope required his approval. All appointments to lucrative positions in the papal states were subject to his recommendation. He was, in every sense that mattered, the man who ran the Vatican. The speed of Scipioni's ascent shocked even the cynical observers of Roman politics. He had not yet taken major orders when his uncle became pope. Within a month, he had been ordained a priest, consecrated a bishop, and elevated to the cardinalate in a single, breathtaking sequence of ceremonies. The red hat that his grandfather Marcantonio had spent a fortune pursuing for his son now sat upon the head of a man barely out of his 20s. The Roman nobles who had dismissed the Borghese as provincial upstarts began to revise their assessments. The ambassadors who had made their careers reading the tea leaves of papal politics added Scipioni's name to their dispatches with a new urgency. Scipione received the criticism that inevitably accompanied his rise with a cool indifference that masked a ferocious determination. When a Spanish diplomat remarked within his hearing that the new cardinal nephew was too young and too inexperienced for the burdens of his office, Scipione reportedly turned to him with a smile that did not reach his eyes and replied, "I do not need to be old to be powerful. I only need to be the Pope's nephew." It was a brutal statement of the reality of papal nepotism, and it silenced the diplomat. But more than a defense, it was a declaration of intent. Scipione Borghese would not apologize for his family's success. He would build upon it, expand it, and ensure that when Paul V died, the Borghese name would be so deeply woven into the fabric of Rome that no future pope could tear it out. The first task was to secure the family's financial future. The papacy in the 17th century was not merely a spiritual office. It was a vast political and economic enterprise. The Pope controlled the papal states, a swath of territory that stretched across central Italy from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. He levied taxes, appointed governors, and commanded armies. And the family of a pope could expect to benefit from these resources in ways that would make them among the wealthiest dynasties in Italy. Scipione set about this work with a methodical intensity that his uncle's contemporaries had not anticipated. He began by consolidating the family's holdings in Rome. The Borghese had purchased a modest palace near the Campo Marzio in the years before Camillo's election, but it was inadequate for a family now at the center of papal power. Scipione identified a larger property on the Via Ripetta, a location that offered proximity to the Vatican and to the commercial heart of the city. He negotiated the purchase with a combination of papal funds and family assets, and within a year, the Palazzo Borghese began its transformation into one of the grandest residences in Rome. The renovation was not merely a matter of pride, it was a statement of permanence. The Borghese were not transient occupants of power, they were building a dynasty. Beyond Rome, Scipione acquired land with a hunger that bordered on obsession. The papal treasury, under the careful management of Paul V, provided the capital. Scipioni's agents fanned out across the countryside of Lazio and Umbria, purchasing estates, vineyards, and castles from noble families whose fortunes had declined. The Borghese holdings grew to include vast agricultural lands that produced grain, wine, and olive oil, the commodities that fed Rome and filled the coffers of the families who controlled them. Scipione was not merely accumulating wealth, he was constructing an economic foundation that would support his family for generations, independent of the papacy's favor. But land and palaces were only the visible architecture of Scipioni's ambition. The invisible architecture, the network of clients, allies, and dependents, was equally important. He began to fill the papal bureaucracy with men who owed their positions to the Borghese. He appointed relatives and loyalists to governorships in the papal states, ensuring that the levers of local power answered to his family. He cultivated relationships with the major religious orders, particularly the Jesuits, whose educational network and global reach made them invaluable allies, and he established a system of patronage that extended from the highest ranks of the Roman nobility to the artisans and shopkeepers whose loyalty could be purchased with a contract or a favor. The critics who had dismissed Scipione as a boy playing at power began to understand their mistake. He was not a boy. He was a man who had learned from his uncle the patient art of accumulation and who possessed an appetite for risk and a ruthlessness in execution that his uncle, for all his calculation, had never shown. Within 3 years of Paul V's election, Scipione Borghese was the richest man in Rome, the undisputed master of the papal court, and the architect of a family fortune that would make the Borghese name synonymous with power. And yet, for all his wealth and influence, Scipione understood that something was missing. Money could buy palaces and lands, could purchase the loyalty of cardinals and the obedience of bureaucrats, but it could not buy immortality. The great families of Rome, the Farnese, the Colonna, the Orsini, had built their legends not on the wealth they accumulated, but on the beauty they created. They had filled their palaces with paintings and sculptures that declared their taste and their lineage. They had commissioned chapels and fountains and gardens that became part of Rome's sacred geography. The Borghese, Scipione knew, needed more than power. They needed a monument that would outlast the papacy, outlast the family itself, and secure their place in the eternal city. In the autumn of 1608, Scipione made a decision that would define his legacy more than any political maneuver. He began to look for a piece of land outside the city walls, a vineyard on the Pincian Hill that had once belonged to the ancient gardens of Lucullus. The property was overgrown, its vines neglected, its views of Rome obscured by centuries of neglect. But Scipione saw what others could not, a site where a villa could rise that would rival the villas of antiquity, a garden that would become a refuge for the popes and a monument to the family that built it. He purchased the land that year, and the Villa Borghese began its journey from abandoned vineyard to one of the wonders of Rome. But the villa, Scipione knew, needed more than walls and gardens. It needed soul, and the soul of the Villa Borghese would be art collected with the same ruthlessness that had built the family fortune, art that would tell the world who the Borghese were and what they aspired to become. In the years that followed, Scipione Borghese would become the most aggressive, the most unapologetic, and the most successful art collector of his age. He would take paintings from churches, sculptures from noble collections, and ancient marbles from the ruins of Rome itself, all in the service of a single, consuming vision: to make the Borghese name immortal. The quiet law professor from Siena, the cardinal who had waited decades for his chance, the orphaned boy who had learned to turn loss into leverage, they had built the foundation. Now, the structure would rise, and in the marble and paint of Rome's greatest collection, the Borghese quest for papal power would find its most enduring expression. The purple that draped the shoulders of Scipione Borghese was not the violet of Lenten penitence. It was the rich, imperial purple of ancient Rome, the color worn by emperors when they processed through the Arch of Titus to claim their triumphs. The cardinals of the Catholic Church had worn this color for centuries, a symbol of their elevation above the ranks of mere bishops, their participation in the governance of Christendom. But on Scipione Borghese, the purple seemed to burn with a different meaning. It was the color of a man who had grasped power at 26 and intended to keep it until his fingers turned to marble. The Rome that Scipione governed in the first years of Paul V's papacy was a city of extremes. It was the spiritual capital of Western Christendom, a place where pilgrims came by the thousands to kneel at the tombs of the apostles and receive the blessings of the Pope. But it was also a city of staggering inequality, where the great families lived in palaces that rivaled the Vatican itself, while the poor crowded into the low-lying districts near the Tiber, where malaria rose with the summer floods and bread was measured in ounces, not loaves. The papacy was the largest landlord, the largest employer, and the largest source of patronage in the city. To control the papacy was to control Rome. And to control Rome was to hold a lever that could shift the balance of power in Europe. Scipione understood this with an instinct that his critics mistook for mere greed. He moved through the city not as a prince of the church, but as a prince of this world, his household swelling to include hundreds of retainers, his carriage a rolling fortress of gilt and leather, his presence at public ceremonies a calculated display of Borghese supremacy. When he attended the consistory, the formal meeting of cardinals with the Pope, he entered the apostolic palace through a corridor that his uncle had ordered built specifically to connect the Borghese apartments to the Vatican. The corridor was a message carved in stone. The Borghese were not guests in this city. They were its masters. The political machine that Scipione built in these years was a masterpiece of patronage and pressure. He began by systematically dismantling the networks of families who had dominated the papal court under previous popes. The Aldobrandini, the family of Clement VII, had controlled vast territories and lucrative offices during the previous papacy. Scipione moved against them with a cold precision that left no room for appeal. He revoked their leases on papal land. He reassigned their clients to distant bishoprics where their influence would wither. He encouraged lawsuits against their allies, ensuring that the papal courts, now under Borghese control, ruled against them at every turn. Within 2 years, the Aldobrandini had retreated from Rome to their ancestral estates, their power reduced to bitter memories and whispered resentment. The Ludovisi, the family of Gregory XV, suffered a similar fate. Scipione targeted their commercial interests, cutting off the papal contracts that had made them wealthy. He cultivated rivals within their own faction, promising advancement to any cardinal who would break with the Ludovisi and pledge loyalty to the Borghese. The message was unmistakable. In the Rome of Paul V, there was only one family that mattered. To serve the Borghese was to rise. To oppose them was to fall into the oblivion that awaited all who challenged the nephew of the Pope. But Scipione was not merely a destroyer. He was also a builder, and the structure he built was the most elaborate system of patronage that Rome had seen since the days of Sixtus V. He maintained a list. Some said it was written in his own hand, others that it was kept by a secretary whose lips had been sealed with a pension for life of every office in the papal gift. Bishoprics in the papal states, governorships in the provincial towns, positions in the Vatican bureaucracy, contracts for grain and salt and timber. Beside each office, he recorded the name of the man who currently held it, the date his term would expire, and the names of those who sought it. When a position became vacant, Scipione did not auction it to the highest bidder, as previous cardinals had done. He awarded it to the man who would be most useful to the Borghese, the man whose loyalty could be counted upon in a conclave, whose family controlled a strategic fortress, whose wealth could be directed toward Borghese projects. The system was efficient, ruthless, and utterly without sentiment. Scipione did not reward friendship, he rewarded utility. When a cardinal who had supported Paul V's election came to him with a request for a benefice for his nephew, Scipione granted it with a smile and a warm embrace. When a cardinal who had opposed the Borghese in the conclave came seeking a favor, Scipione received him with equal courtesy, listened to his petition with every appearance of sympathy, and then did nothing. The message was delivered not with a blow but with silence. In the corridors of Vatican power, silence was the loudest condemnation. The wealth that flowed into Borghese coffers during these years was staggering. Scipioni's official income from his numerous bishoprics, abbeys, and benefices, all of them granted by his uncle, amounted to tens of thousands of scudi annually. But this was only the visible portion of his fortune. The real wealth came from the informal economy of papal patronage. When a bishop was appointed, Scipione expected a gift in gratitude. When a contract was awarded, the contractor understood that a percentage would find its way to the cardinal nephew's treasury. When a noble family sought papal approval for a marriage or a title, they came to Scipione first, and they came bearing gold. The Roman wits, who observed all this with a mixture of admiration and disgust, composed verses that circulated in manuscript among the literate classes. One of them, attributed to the satirist Giulio Cesare Capaccio, ran, "The Borghese have found a new way to fish. They cast the net of the church and haul in the world." Scipione, when the verse was repeated to him, laughed. He had no patience for hypocrisy. Every great family of Rome had done the same in its time. The difference was that the Borghese were doing it better. Yet even as Scipione accumulated wealth and power with a single-mindedness that astonished his contemporaries, he understood that something was required of him in return. The papacy was not a hereditary monarchy, and Paul V would not live forever. When his uncle died, and Scipione prayed it would be many years distant, a new pope would be elected, and that new pope would bring his own family, his own favorites, his own ambitions. The Borghese could not rely on the papacy alone to sustain them. They needed something that no future pope could take away. They needed a legacy carved in stone, painted in oil, sculpted in marble. They needed art. In 1608, the same year Scipione purchased the vineyard that would become the Villa Borghese, he made another acquisition that announced his ambitions to the world. A collection of ancient sculptures, excavated from the ruins of a Roman villa on the Via Appia, came up for sale. The collection included a marble of Apollo pursuing Daphne, a work of such exquisite craftsmanship that connoisseurs dated it to the age of Augustus. Scipione bought it for a sum that made the Roman art world gasp. He installed it in his new villa, still under construction, and invited the leading artists of Rome to view it. Among them was a young sculptor, barely 20 years old, whose work had already caught the cardinal's eye. His name was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Scipione looked at the ancient Apollo and then at the young sculptor. He saw not a boy but a tool, an instrument capable of creating works that would rival the masterpieces of antiquity. In the years that followed, he would forge Bernini into the greatest artist of his age. But he would do it not for the love of art. He would do it for the glory of the Borghese. The art that Scipione Borghese began to collect in these years was not acquired through the patient cultivation of artists and the respectful negotiation with patrons. It was acquired through the same instruments that had built his fortune, power, money, and a willingness to take what he wanted without apology. The great paintings and sculptures that filled the Villa Borghese were not gifts freely given. They were confiscations, seizures, and purchases made at prices that no one dared refute. And the most famous of these acquisitions, the one that would become the centerpiece of the Borghese collection and the symbol of Scipione's ruthless ambition, was a painting that had been commissioned for a church, venerated by the faithful, and taken from its altar in the dark of night. The painting was Caravaggio's The Entombment of Christ, a work that had revolutionized religious art when it was unveiled in 1604. The artist, Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, had rejected the idealized saints and serene martyrdoms of Renaissance painting. His Christ was a dead man, his body heavy with the weight of mortality, his flesh the color of cold marble. The mourners who lowered him into the tomb were not celestial beings, but ordinary men and women, their faces etched with the raw, unvarnished grief of those who have lost someone they love. The painting had been commissioned for the Chiesa Nuova, the church of the Oratorian order, and it hung above the altar of a chapel that had been built specifically to display it. The Oratorians understood that they possessed a masterpiece, and they guarded it accordingly. Scipione Borghese wanted it. He did not want it because he loved Caravaggio's art, though he appreciated its power. He wanted it because the Chiesa Nuova was located in the heart of Rome, a few hundred yards from the Palazzo Borghese, and the painting's fame was a magnet for the pilgrims and connoisseurs who passed through the city. To possess the entombment was to possess a piece of Rome's artistic soul, to declare that the Borghese taste was the taste that defined the city. And Scipione, who had built his power on the principle that what he wanted he took, saw no reason to make an exception for a painting. The legal mechanism he used was as ingenious as it was cynical. The Oratorian order owed the papal treasury a debt, a modest sum, the result of some administrative oversight that had been allowed to accumulate over the years. Scipione, in his capacity as cardinal nephew and the Pope's representative in financial matters, called in the debt. He gave the Oratorians a choice: pay the sum in full or surrender something of equivalent value to satisfy the papal treasury. The Oratorians, who had no liquid funds to speak of, looked at their possessions and saw only one thing that might satisfy the cardinal. In 1608, the entombment of Christ was removed from its altar and carried across Rome to the Palazzo Borghese. The Oratorians protested. They appealed to Paul V directly, reminding the Pope of their order's loyalty and their church's importance to the spiritual life of Rome. Paul V listened with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime in the law. Then he did nothing. The painting remained in Borghese hands, and the Oratorians learned what every family and every institution in Rome was learning. When Scipione Borghese wanted something, the law bent to accommodate him. The acquisition of the entombment was only the most famous of Scipione's confiscations. He seized paintings from churches across Rome and the Papal States, always finding a legal pretext, always ensuring that the protests of the clergy and the laity were met with the implacable silence of papal authority. He acquired Raphael's deposition from the Church of San Francesco al Prato in Perugia, a city that was part of the Papal States and therefore subject to Borghese jurisdiction. He took Titian's sacred and profane love from the collection of a noble family whose patriarch had fallen out of favor with the Borghese regime. He gathered sculptures from the ruins of ancient Rome, employing teams of laborers to excavate the sites where previous generations had been content to leave the past buried. The villa that Scipione was building on the Pincian Hill became the repository for this accumulated beauty. He hired the architect Flaminio Ponzio to transform the old vineyard into a structure that would combine the grandeur of a Roman palace with the intimacy of a country retreat. The facade, when it was completed, was simple and severe, a deliberate contrast to the ornate palaces of the Roman nobility. But the interior was something else entirely. Scipione filled it with the works he had collected, arranging them in rooms designed specifically to display them to maximum effect. Visitors to the Villa Borghese in these years described walking through galleries where the walls seemed to breathe with color, where the marble floors reflected the paintings above them, where every surface was a testament to Borghese wealth and Borghese taste. Yet even as the villa rose and the collection grew, Scipione understood that he could not rely on the art of the past to secure his family's future. The ancient marbles and the Renaissance masterpieces were treasures, but they were the treasures of other ages, other families, other ambitions. To create a truly Borghese legacy, he needed to commission new works that would bear the family's name and embody its vision. And in the young sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Scipione believed he had found the instrument that would carve his family's name into the stone of eternity. Bernini came to Scipioni's attention in 1618, when the sculptor was 20 years old. He was the son of a Florentine sculptor who had moved to Rome seeking patronage, and from an early age, his talent had been impossible to ignore. Scipione, who had an eye for genius that rivaled his eye for profit, recognized in Bernini a combination of technical virtuosity and imaginative daring that reminded him of the great artists of antiquity. He took the young man into his household, gave him a room in the Palazzo Borghese, and began to commission works that would test the limits of his talent. The first major commission was a sculpture of Aeneas fleeing Troy, carrying his father Anchises on his shoulders. It was a subject that resonated with Scipioni's ambitions, the founding of a new dynasty, the transmission of authority from one generation to the next, the burden of legacy. Bernini carved the group from a single block of marble, a technical challenge that would have daunted sculptors twice his age. When it was unveiled in the Villa Borghese, the response was immediate and unanimous. A new genius had arrived in Rome. Scipione commissioned again, a sculpture of Apollo pursuing Daphne, the moment when the god's hand touches the nymph's skin and she begins her transformation into a laurel tree. Bernini carved the marble so finely that the leaves seemed to tremble, the bark to pulse with life, the fingers of Apollo to press against Daphne's flesh with the urgency of desire. When Scipione saw the finished work, he reportedly recited a line from the poet Ovid, "The finger of the lover, the leaf of the laurel." It was a moment of genuine aesthetic pleasure from a man whose pleasures were usually measured in gold. But the sculpture that best captured the spirit of the Borghese, the ambition, the tension, the coiled energy of a family that had risen from nowhere to the heights of power, was Bernini's David. Unlike Michelangelo's David, which stands in calm contemplation before his battle, Bernini's David is caught in the moment of action. His body twists, his muscles strain, his face is contorted with concentration. He is not a hero awaiting his destiny. He is a man in the grip of it, his entire being focused on a single, decisive act. The sculpture was commissioned for Scipioni's nephew, another Borghese prince who would carry the family name into the next generation. But it was Scipione himself who saw himself in the twisting form, the man who had seized power with a concentration of will that left no room for doubt or hesitation. The villa, the collection, the patronage of Bernini, these were the visible monuments of Borghese power, but they were also something else. They were the expressions of a psychological truth that Scipione Borghese understood better than any of his contemporaries. The great families of Rome had built their power on land and arms, on alliances and marriages. They had accumulated wealth and dispensed patronage, but they had rarely understood that art was not merely ornament. Art was the medium through which power became immortality. A palace could be looted, a fortune could be squandered, a dynasty could fall from favor. But a painting by Caravaggio, a sculpture by Bernini, these would endure. They would carry the Borghese name into centuries that would forget the politics of the papal court, the factions of the conclave, the rise and fall of families. Scipione Borghese was building for eternity, and in the winter of 1621, when Paul V died after a 16-year reign, Scipione learned whether his foundation was strong enough to survive the loss of the power that had built it. The death of Paul V on the 28th of January, 1621, plunged Scipione Borghese into the most dangerous moment of his life. For 16 years, he had governed Rome from the shadow of his uncle's throne, accumulating wealth, dispensing patronage, and making enemies with a casual confidence that assumed the papacy would last forever. But the papacy did not last forever. The throne of St. Peter was not a Borghese inheritance, and the cardinals who gathered for the conclave in February of 1621 included men who had waited 16 years for the opportunity to humble the man who had treated them as servants and rivals. Scipione understood the danger with a clarity that cut through his usual composure. He had made enemies of the Aldobrandini and the Ludovisi, families whose power had been eclipsed by Borghese ambition. He had alienated the Spanish faction by favoring French interests in the final years of his uncle's papacy. He had accumulated a fortune that made every cardinal in Rome aware of what they might seize if the Borghese fell from favor. And he had done all of this without cultivating the one thing that might protect him in a conclave, a candidate of his own who could succeed his uncle and continue the Borghese ascendancy. The conclave that opened in February was the largest in decades, with 68 cardinals entering the sealed chambers of the Apostolic Palace. Scipione entered with them, his scarlet robes concealing the tension in his jaw, his hands steady despite the calculations racing through his mind. He knew that he could not be elected. His youth, his wealth, his reputation for worldliness made him unacceptable to the factions that demanded a pope of spiritual authority and diplomatic neutrality. But he also knew that a pope hostile to the Borghese would dismantle everything he had built. The estates, the palace, the villa, the collection, all of it could be seized by a determined pontiff acting through the machinery of the church. Scipione had used that machinery to enrich his family. Now he faced the prospect of watching another family use it to strip the Borghese bare. The conclave lasted 3 weeks, a period of tension that Scipione later described to a confidant as the longest of his life. He maneuvered as he had always maneuvered, offering support, withholding it, promising and threatening in equal measure. But the forces aligned against him were stronger than he had anticipated. The Aldobrandini and the Ludovisi had formed an alliance with the Spanish ambassador, who carried instructions from Madrid to block any candidate who might continue Paul V's policies. Scipione's preferred candidates fell one by one, vetoed by Spain or abandoned by allies who saw the direction of the wind. On the 21st day, the cardinals elected Alessandro Ludovisi, a Bolognese cardinal who had served as a diplomat and administrator under several popes. He took the name Gregory XV, and Scipione Borghese watched from the benches of the Sistine Chapel as a member of his rival family ascended to the throne that his own uncle had occupied for 16 years. The Borghese ascendancy was over. What followed in the first months of Gregory XV's papacy was a systematic dismantling of Borghese power. The new pope moved with a speed that suggested he had been planning these actions for years. He revoked the privileges that Paul V had granted to Scipione's clients. He opened investigations into the financial transactions of the previous papacy, a threat that hung over Scipione's head like a blade suspended by a thread. He appointed members of his own family to the positions that Scipione had controlled, filling the papal bureaucracy with Ludovisi loyalists who understood that their advancement depended on the humiliation of the Borghese. Scipione retreated to the Villa Borghese, the monument he had built on the Pincian Hill, and waited. He did not flee Rome as some advised. He did not beg for mercy as his enemies expected. He waited and he watched and he calculated. The villa became his fortress, its gardens his refuge, its galleries his armor. He walked among the sculptures of Bernini, the paintings of Caravaggio, the ancient marbles he had excavated from the ruins of Rome, and he reminded himself of what he had built that no pope could take away. Gregory XV's papacy lasted only 2 years. The pope, already elderly when elected, fell ill in the summer of 1623 and died on the 8th of July. The conclave that followed was shorter than the previous one, and its outcome was determined by factions that Scipione had been quietly cultivating during his years of exile from power. He had learned from his humiliation. He had not made the same mistake twice. When the smoke turned white on the 6th of August, 1623, the man who emerged as Pope Urban VIII was Maffei Barberini, a cardinal who owed his election in part to Scipioni's support, and who understood that the Borghese were not a family to be dismissed. The Barberini papacy would last 21 years, and during those years, Scipione Borghese would rebuild his family's position with the same ruthless efficiency that had marked his uncle's reign. But something had changed in him during the years of Gregory XV. The raw ambition that had driven him to seize paintings from churches and sculptures from ruins had been tempered by the knowledge that power was temporary. The man who emerged from the Villa Borghese in 1623 was not the young cardinal who had boasted that he did not need to be old to be powerful. He was a man who understood that the only power worth having was the power that outlasted popes and papacies, the power that was carved in marble and painted in oil, the power that survived the fall of families and the rise of new dynasties. In the years that followed, Scipione turned his attention more fully to the project that had always been his true legacy. The Villa Borghese expanded, its gardens growing to encompass the entire Pincian Hill, its galleries filling with new acquisitions that rivaled the old. Bernini continued to work for the Borghese, his genius now recognized throughout Europe, his sculptures becoming the treasures that princes and prelates competed to acquire. And Scipione, who had once measured his success in the number of offices he controlled and the amount of gold in his treasury, began to measure it in something else. The footsteps of visitors who walked through his galleries and marveled at what the Borghese had built. He did not become a different man. He remained ruthless in his dealings, calculating in his friendships, implacable in his defense of Borghese interests. But the edge of his ambition had been sharpened into something more refined. The young cardinal who had seized Caravaggio's masterpiece from a church altar had become an old man who understood that the painting would outlast him, outlast the Borghese, outlast the papacy itself. He had not stolen it for his own pleasure. He had stolen it for eternity. Scipione Borghese died on the 2nd of October, 1633, in his apartments at the Palazzo Borghese, surrounded by the art that had been the passion of his life. He was 57 years old, an age that seemed ancient to the young men who had once marveled at his rise, but young to the old men who remembered the days of Paul V. He left behind a family that had survived the fall of a pope and the rise of another, a fortune that rivaled the greatest in Rome, and a villa that contained one of the most extraordinary collections of art ever assembled by a single individual. But he also left behind something else, a question that would haunt the Borghese for generations. The art that he had collected with such ruthlessness, the villa that he had built with such ambition, the legacy that he had carved from the stone and paint of Rome. What did it mean? Was it the monument of a family that had risen from obscurity to the heights of power? Or was it the gilded cage that would confine them, the beautiful prison from which they could never escape? The purple and the gold that Scipione had worn so confidently had purchased immortality for the Borghese name. But the price of that immortality was a burden that would grow heavier with each generation, as the descendants of the man from Siena learned to live in the shadow of the empire he had built. The sun that falls upon Rome in the autumn of 1624 is a sculptor's sun, a light that carves shadows from marble and turns the dust of the streets into gold. Scipione Borghese, newly restored to favor under Pope Urban VIII, stands at the window of his villa on the Pincian Hill and watches the light move across the city he has spent his life mastering. Below him, the gardens he has planted are coming into their maturity, cypresses that rise like dark flames against the sky, fountains that toss water into the air as if to capture the light and hold it, paths that wind through groves of oak and laurel with a deliberate, artful randomness. The villa itself is no longer building under construction. It is a completed thing, a monument to a vision that Scipione has pursued for nearly 20 years. And yet, as he stands at the window, he knows that it is not complete. It will never be complete, because the appetite that drives him to collect is not an appetite that can be satisfied. It is a hunger that grows with every acquisition, a thirst that deepens with every draft. The art that fills the Villa Borghese is the most extraordinary private collection in Europe. Visitors who manage to secure an invitation, and Scipione controls access to his galleries as carefully as he controls access to the Vatican, walk through rooms that seem to contain the whole history of beauty. Ancient marbles from the ruins of imperial Rome stand beside the most daring works of the modern age. Caravaggio's entombment occupies a chapel that Scipione built specifically for it, its darkness illuminated by windows placed so that the light falls upon the dead Christ as if from heaven. Raphael's deposition hangs in a room whose walls are painted to echo its colors, the whole space a frame for the masterpiece at its center. And everywhere, in every gallery, in every corridor, in every niche carved into the walls of the gardens, there are the sculptures of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, works that seem to breathe, to move, to live. Scipione discovered Bernini when the sculptor was still a boy, and he has nurtured him with the same ruthless care that he has devoted to his collection. He gave the young man a room in the Palazzo Borghese, introduced him to the cardinals and princes who would become his patrons, and commissioned from him the works that would make him famous. But Scipione's patronage is not the generosity of a connoisseur. It is the investment of a man who understands that the greatest art of his age will carry the name of its patron as surely as it carries the name of its creator. When Bernini sculpts Apollo reaching for Daphne, the world sees the genius of the artist. But the world also sees the Borghese villa where it stands, the Borghese wealth that paid for it, the Borghese taste that selected it. Scipione has made himself the frame through which Bernini's genius is viewed, and the frame, he knows, is as important as the painting. The relationship between patron and artist is not a simple one. Bernini is a man of explosive temperament, prone to rages and depressions, capable of working for days without sleep, and then collapsing into a stupor that lasts for hours. He is also a man of consuming ambition, driven to surpass Michelangelo, to carve from marble what no sculptor has carved before. Scipione understands this ambition because he shares it. He sees in Bernini a reflection of his own hunger, his own refusal to accept the limits that nature and circumstance have placed upon him. And he feeds that hunger with commissions, with praise, with the constant pressure of a patron who expects nothing less than perfection. The sculpture that comes to define their collaboration is not the Apollo and Daphne or the David, magnificent as those works are. It is a portrait, a bust of Camillo Borghese himself, carved in marble that Bernini has chosen from a quarry near Carrara, a stone so white and so fine that it seems to glow from within. Scipione sits for the sculptor in the winter of 1632, his face creased by the years, his jaw set with the determination that has never left him. Bernini works quickly, his chisel moving with a speed that seems impossible, his fingers reading the grain of the marble as a musician reads a score. When the bust is finished, it is not a portrait of a cardinal or a prince of the church. It is a portrait of a man who has spent his life grasping for power, who has built an empire from the ruins of others, who has seized paintings from churches and sculptures from ruins and a villa from a hillside, and who now sits in his garden and watches the sun set on the city he has tried to own. The bust captures something that no painting could capture. The eyes are not the eyes of a man who rests. They are the eyes of a man who watches, who calculates, who waits for the moment when he can reach out and take what he wants. The mouth is set in a line that is not quite a smile, not quite a frown, the expression of a man who has learned that power is not worn on the surface, but carried in the bone. Bernini has carved the folds of the cassock, the weight of the scarlet cape, the texture of the skin with a realism that shocks anyone who sees it. But the shock is not the skill. The shock is the recognition. This is Scipione Borghese, the man who built a dynasty on the ruins of his enemies, rendered in marble that will outlast his enemies, outlast his family, outlast Rome itself. When the bust is unveiled, Scipione looks at it for a long time without speaking. The guests who have gathered in the villa, cardinals, princes, ambassadors, artists, wait for his reaction. They expect praise, perhaps a commission for Bernini, perhaps a gesture of the generosity that Scipione can show when it suits him. What they do not expect is the silence. Scipione stands before the marble image of his own face, and for a moment, the mask of the cardinal nephew slips. What lies beneath is something that no one in the room has seen before. A man confronting the fact that he will not live forever, that the empire he has built will one day belong to others, that the only part of him that will survive is the face that Bernini has carved from stone. He turns from the bust without speaking. He walks to the window that overlooks his gardens, his fountains, his cypresses, his Rome, and he speaks finally in a voice that is softer than anyone in the room has ever heard from him. "This is how I will be remembered," he says, "not for what I did, but for what I made." It is a moment of clarity, a glimpse of the truth that Scipione has spent his life trying to escape. The power he has wielded, the wealth he has accumulated, the enemies he has crushed, these will fade. The portraits of his enemies will gather dust in forgotten galleries. The alliances he has forged will dissolve into the shifting sands of papal politics. But the marble will remain. The paintings will hang on walls that future generations will build. The villa will stand on the Pincian Hill, its gardens open to the public, its galleries filled with the footsteps of strangers who will never know the name of the man who built it, but who will see his face in the bust that Bernini carved and wonder who he was. In the years that follow, Scipione will commission Bernini again and again. He will build a new facade for the Palazzo Borghese, a chapel for the family in Santa Maria Maggia, a fountain for the gardens that will toss water into the Roman sky for centuries. He will add to his collection with the same hunger that has always driven him, acquiring Titians and Raphaels ancient marbles and modern bronzes, everything that beauty can produce and money can buy. But the urgency that once drove him has changed. He is no longer collecting for the glory of the Borghese. He is collecting for the immortality of the name that Bernini has carved in stone. And as he walks through his galleries in the final years of his life, he sometimes pauses before the bust that Bernini made of him. He looks into the marble eyes that seem to follow him across the room, and he wonders what those eyes will see when he is gone. Will they see the Borghese dynasty flourish or fade? Will they see the villa he built become a museum for the public, its gardens a playground for the children of Rome? Will they see the art he gathered scattered to the winds, or will they see it gathered still, a monument to the hunger of a man who wanted to own eternity? He does not know, he cannot know, but as he stands before the marble face that will outlast him, he allows himself a hope that is not ambition, not calculation, not the cold assessment of power. It is the hope of a man who has spent his life taking, that what he has taken will be worth keeping. The hunger that drove Scipione Borghese to collect the art of Rome was not a hunger that respected boundaries. It did not pause at the doors of churches or the walls of monasteries. It did not acknowledge the claims of the poor who had donated their coins to adorn the altars from which Scipione took their treasures. It recognized only one law, the law of the Borghese, which was the law of the man who held the Pope's ear and the keys to the papal treasury. And in the years of Urban VII's papacy, when Scipioni's influence was restored and his wealth was greater than ever, that hunger reached its fullest expression. The methods Scipione employed to acquire his collection were as varied as the works he sought. Sometimes he bought outright, paying sums that made the seller's eyes water and their objections die on their lips. Sometimes he exchanged, offering a painting from his own collection, always a lesser work, always a calculated sacrifice, for a masterpiece that hung in a church or a noble palace. Sometimes he used the law, finding or creating pretexts to seize works that would not be sold or exchanged. And sometimes, when all else failed, he simply took. The most notorious of these takings involved a painting that had been commissioned for the Church of Santa Maria in Vallicella, the mother church of the Oratorian order. The painting was Caravaggio's Madonna of the Palafreniere, a work that had caused scandal when it was unveiled in 1606 because it depicted the Virgin Mary barefoot and surrounded by ordinary people rather than saints. The Oratorians had removed the painting from their church after a few years, uncomfortable with its radical simplicity, and it had passed into the hands of a noble family who kept it in a private chapel. Scipione wanted it. He approached the family with an offer of purchase, and when they refused, the painting was a gift from an ancestor, they said, a matter of family honor, he turned to the courts. The case that followed was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Scipione's lawyers argued that the painting had been improperly removed from the Oratorian church, that the transfer to the noble family had been invalid under canon law, and that the work therefore reverted to the papal treasury, which Scipione controlled. The judges, who owed their positions to the Borghese, ruled in his favor. The painting was seized from the family's chapel and carried to the Villa Borghese, where Scipione installed it in a room that he decorated to echo its somber tone. The family that had owned it for 2 generations received nothing but the memory of what they had lost. The story of the Madonna of the Palafreniere circulated through Rome with the speed of scandal. It was told in the workshops of artists who feared for their own works, in the palaces of nobles who wondered if their collections were safe, in the churches where priests looked at the paintings above their altars and wondered if the cardinal nephew would come for them next. But it was told in whispers, because the man who had taken the painting was the same man who controlled the favors of the Pope, and in Rome, a whisper was safer than a shout. Scipione heard the whispers, and he did not care. He had built his life on the principle that power was for using, and he had used it to gather around himself the most extraordinary collection of art that any individual had ever assembled. The whispers of the powerless were the price of greatness, and Scipione Borghese had never been afraid to pay a price. But the collecting was not only about taking, it was also about creating. And in the workshops and studios that Scipione patronized, a new kind of art was being born, an art that reflected the spirit of the Borghese as surely as Caravaggio's darkness reflected the spirit of the Counter-Reformation. The artists who worked for Scipione understood that they were not merely creating beautiful objects, they were creating the face of a dynasty. And the face they created was one of power, of ambition, of a family that had risen from the dust of Siena to the marble of Rome. Domenichino, the painter who had studied under Annibale Carracci and absorbed the lessons of the Renaissance masters, came to Scipioni's attention in the 1620s. He was a man of quiet temperament, devout and disciplined, the opposite of the turbulent Caravaggio. But his work had a clarity and a grace that appealed to Scipioni's sense of order. He commissioned from Domenichino a series of paintings for the Villa Borghese, scenes from the life of Diana, the huntress, that filled the walls of a gallery designed specifically for them. The paintings were not revolutionary, they were not scandalous, they were beautiful in a way that seemed effortless, a perfection that concealed the labor that had produced it. Scipione valued Domenichino because Domenichino understood something that few artists understood, that art for the Borghese was not about the expression of the artist's soul, it was about the expression of the patron's power. The paintings in the Villa Borghese were not there to challenge or to disturb, they were there to awe, to impress, to create an atmosphere of wealth and taste so overwhelming that visitors would leave knowing that they had been in the presence of greatness. The artists who worked for Scipione learned to navigate this reality. They learned to accept his interference, his demands, his sometimes brutal criticisms. They learned that a commission from the cardinal nephew was the surest path to fame and fortune, but that it came at the cost of their independence. And they learned that when Scipione Borghese looked at a painting, he was not looking for beauty. He was looking for the measure of its value, not its aesthetic value, but its value as a weapon in the war for immortality. The war had no end. Every acquisition was a victory, but every victory revealed new territory to be conquered. Scipioni's agents scoured the markets of Rome, Naples, Venice, and Florence, seeking works that would fill the gaps in his collection. He acquired ancient marbles from the ruins of Hadrian's villa, bronzes from the excavations at the baths of Caracalla, gems and cameos from the cabinets of collectors who had fallen into debt. He bought paintings from the heirs of the Farnese, the Este, the Della Rovere, families whose power had once rivaled his own, but whose fortunes had declined in the changing winds of papal politics. Each acquisition was a stone in the monument he was building, and the monument grew with each passing year, its foundations sinking deeper into the soil of Rome, its walls rising higher against the sky. But the monument was not only for Scipione. It was for the Borghese who would come after him, the nephews and grandnephews who would inherit the name and the fortune and the burden of maintaining what he had built. And as Scipione grew older, as the face that Bernini had carved from marble began to match the face that looked back at him from his mirror, he began to think about what he would leave behind. The art would remain, the villa would remain. But would the family that had created them remain worthy of them? He had no answer to this question. He could only build and collect and hope that the generations to come would understand what he had understood, that the Borghese name was not a birthright to be enjoyed, but a trust to be preserved. The art in the Villa Borghese was not a collection of beautiful objects. It was a responsibility, and the family that could not bear that responsibility would lose not only its fortune, but its soul. In the final years of his life, Scipione began to turn his attention to the structure that would house his collection for the centuries to come. The Villa Borghese, magnificent as it was, had been built as a country retreat, a place of pleasure and display. But Scipione envisioned something more, a building that would be a museum in the modern sense, a space where the art could be seen and studied by those who had the taste and the education to appreciate it. He commissioned architects to design new wings, new galleries, new spaces that would display his collection in ways that told the story of the Borghese as he wanted it told. He did not live to see these plans completed. On the 2nd of October, 1633, Scipione Borghese died in his apartments at the Palazzo Borghese, surrounded by the art that had been the passion of his life. The funeral that followed was one of the grandest Rome had ever seen, a procession of cardinals and princes that stretched from the Palazzo Borghese to Santa Maria Maggia, where Scipione was buried in the chapel he had built for his family. The eulogies praised his piety, his learning, his service to the church. They did not mention the paintings he had taken from altars, the sculptures he had seized from noble families, the fortunes he had accumulated through the offices of his uncle. Those things were not for eulogies, they were for history. And history, Scipione Borghese understood, would remember him not for the piety he had displayed in public, but for the hunger that had driven him in private. It would remember the man who had built a villa on the Pincian Hill and filled it with the most extraordinary collection of art ever assembled. It would remember the patron of Bernini, the collector of Caravaggio, the man who had made the Borghese name synonymous with beauty and power. It would remember the face that Bernini had carved in marble, the face of a man who had wanted to own eternity and had come as close as any mortal could. But it would also remember the cost, the churches that had lost their masterpieces, the families that had been stripped of their heirlooms, the artists who had been bent to the will of a patron who saw art not as an expression of the human spirit, but as a tool of dynastic ambition. These things were also part of the legacy. And as the doors of the Villa Borghese closed behind the mourners, as the cypresses swayed in the autumn wind, as the fountains tossed their water into the Roman air, the question that Scipione had asked himself in his final years hung over the villa like a shadow. What happens to a dynasty when the hunger that built it is gone? The death of Scipione Borghese did not end the collecting. It could not. The machine he had built, the network of agents, the relationships with artists, the legal apparatus for acquisition, continued to operate, driven by the momentum of the fortune he had accumulated and the ambition he had instilled in his heirs. But something was missing. The hand that had guided the machine was gone, and the men who inherited it did not possess the same hunger, the same vision, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of a painting or a sculpture. Scipioni's heirs were his nephews, the sons of his brother Francesco. The eldest, Marcantonio, was a young man of 27 when his uncle died, raised in the shadow of Scipioni's greatness, taught to revere the collection that had been assembled over a lifetime. He understood the value of what he had inherited. He knew that the paintings in the Villa Borghese were worth more than the papal treasury, that the sculptures by Bernini were beyond price, that the collection was not merely a collection but a trust, a responsibility that had been passed to him by a man who had treated art as a sacred duty. But Marcantonio was not Scipione. He did not have his uncle's ruthlessness, his willingness to bend the law and the church to his will. He did not have his uncle's eye, the ability to look at a painting and know instantly whether it was a masterpiece or a mediocrity. He did not have his uncle's hunger, the consuming need to possess that had driven Scipione to take Caravaggio from its altar and Raphael from its church. He had inherited the collection, but he had not inherited the soul that had created it. The years that followed Scipioni's death were years of consolidation rather than expansion. Marcantonio maintained the villa and its contents with the care of a steward rather than the passion of a collector. He opened the galleries to visitors more freely than Scipione had, allowing the art that his uncle had gathered for the glory of the Borghese to be seen by the scholars and connoisseurs who came to Rome from across Europe. He commissioned new works from the artists who had worked for his uncle, but he did so with a caution that Scipione would have found contemptible. He was a caretaker, not a builder, and in the generations that followed, the Borghese princes who inherited the villa and its contents would be caretakers as well, men who preserved what Scipione had created but could not add to it in any meaningful way. The art that Scipione had gathered began to change in meaning. During his lifetime, the collection had been a weapon, a tool of dynastic ambition, a statement of Borghese supremacy. After his death, it became something else, a burden, a responsibility, a weight that the Borghese princes carried through the centuries as their political power faded and their wealth diminished. The villa that Scipione had built as a monument to his family's greatness became a museum that the family was obliged to maintain at enormous expense. The paintings that he had seized from churches and palaces became treasures that the family could not sell without scandal. The sculptures that he had commissioned from Bernini became anchors that held the Borghese in a past they could not escape. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible. The Borghese remained one of the great families of Rome, their names spoken with the same reverence as the Colonna and the Orsini. They held their place in papal ceremonies, their princes serving as cardinals and ambassadors, their palaces remaining centers of Roman society. But the fire that had burned in Scipione, the consuming ambition that had driven him to remake Rome in the image of his family, had gone out. The Borghese had become what Scipione had always feared they would become, a family defined not by what they did, but by what they had done, not by what they created, but by what they had inherited. The 18th century brought new challenges. The papacy, which had been the engine of Borghese power, was losing its grip on the politics of Europe. The great powers, France, Spain, Austria, increasingly treated the Pope as a figurehead, a relic of a past that no longer shaped the destinies of nations. The Borghese, whose fortunes had been built on papal favor, found themselves adrift in a world where the favor of the Pope meant less with each passing decade. They sought new sources of influence, new alliances, new ways to maintain the position that Scipione had won for them. But the world was changing faster than the Borghese could change with it. The French Revolution shattered the old order of Europe, and the Borghese, like all the great Roman families, felt the shock. The armies of Napoleon swept through Italy, dismantling the papal states and driving the Pope into exile. The Borghese princes, who had built their identity on their role as papal loyalists, faced a choice: resist the French and risk everything, or accommodate the new regime and betray the tradition that had defined them for 2 centuries. They chose accommodation. It was a decision born of pragmatism rather than principle, and it saved the family's fortune and its collection. But it came at a cost. In 1803, Camillo Borghese, the head of the family, married Pauline Bonaparte, the sister of Napoleon. It was the most brilliant match the Borghese had ever made, a connection to the most powerful man in Europe. But it was also a betrayal of everything the Borghese had stood for since the days of Paul V. The family that had built its power on the papacy had allied itself with the man who had imprisoned the Pope. The princes who had styled themselves the protectors of the church had married into the family that had plundered it. The marriage was not a happy one. Pauline Bonaparte was a woman of immense beauty and immense appetite, a creature of the French imperial court who found Rome provincial and her husband dull. She installed herself in the Villa Borghese, redecorated its rooms in the French fashion, and scandalized Roman society with her affairs and her extravagance. Camillo, who had hoped that his marriage would secure his family's position in the new European order, found himself eclipsed by his wife, his name attached to her scandals, his authority undermined by her independence. But the marriage also brought something unexpected, a new vision for the Villa Borghese. Pauline, who had grown up in the palaces of the French Empire, understood that the villa could be more than a private collection. She saw it as a museum, a treasure house that could be open to the public, a monument to the taste and the power of the family that owned it. Under her influence, the villa was transformed, its gardens open to the people of Rome, its galleries arranged for the display of the collection in a way that anticipated the public museums of the 19th century. When Napoleon fell, the Borghese faced another choice. The papacy was restored, the Pope returned to Rome, and the families who had collaborated with the French found themselves under suspicion. The Borghese, who had married the sister of the Antichrist, as the Pope's supporters called Napoleon, were in a dangerous position. But they had something that no other family had: the Villa Borghese and the collection it contained. The art that Scipione had gathered with such ruthlessness became the family's shield, the thing that made them too valuable to destroy. The popes who followed the Restoration might have stripped the Borghese of their titles and their offices, but they could not strip them of the collection. It was too important, too celebrated, too deeply woven into the fabric of Rome. The 19th century was a century of decline for the Borghese as a political force. The family that had once ruled Rome from the shadow of the papal throne became a family of wealthy landowners, their influence confined to the estates they owned and the salons they hosted. They produced no more popes, no more cardinals of the first rank, no more princes who could shape the destiny of Italy. They became, in the phrase of one Roman observer, a family of beautiful things attached to a family of ordinary men. But the beautiful things remain. The Caravaggio still hung in its chapel, the Bernini still stood in its gallery, the ancient marbles still lined the corridors of the villa that Scipione had built. And as the Borghese princes aged and died, as the family's political power faded into memory, the collection became more important, not less. It was the thing that kept the Borghese name alive, that drew visitors from across the world, that reminded Rome that the family which had once threatened to own eternity had, at least, owned something worth remembering. In 1902, the Borghese made their final decision. The family, facing the same pressures that were transforming all the great Roman families, the rise of democracy, the decline of aristocratic privilege, the crushing weight of taxes on vast landholdings, sold the Villa Borghese and its contents to the Italian state. It was a transaction that shocked Rome, a moment that seemed to mark the end of an era. The villa that Scipione had built for the glory of his family would become a public museum, its gardens a public park, its treasures the property of the Italian people. The decision was not made lightly. The Borghese princes who negotiated the sale understood what they were giving up. They were not merely selling a building and its contents. They were surrendering the identity that Scipione had created for them, the purpose that had sustained their family for 3 centuries. Without the collection, without the villa, without the art that Scipione had gathered to make his family immortal, what were the Borghese? They were a name, a memory, a page in the history books that tourists might read before they walked through the gardens of the villa that no longer belonged to them. But they were also something else. They were the heirs of a man who had understood that art was not about possession, but about eternity. Scipione had gathered his collection not to keep it hidden, but to display it, not to hoard it, but to share it. The villa had been open to visitors during his lifetime, its galleries filled with scholars and connoisseurs who came to marvel at what he had assembled. And in the centuries that followed, the Borghese had maintained that tradition, allowing the art to be seen, to be studied, to be loved by the people of Rome and the pilgrims who came to the eternal city. The sale to the Italian state was not a surrender, it was a fulfillment. Scipione had gathered the art for the glory of his family, but he had also gathered it for the glory of Rome. And when the Borghese princes signed the papers that transferred the villa and its contents to the nation, they were completing the work that Scipione had begun. The art that had been taken from churches and palaces, that had been seized from noble families and purchased from fallen dynasties, was finally being returned to the people who had always been its true owners. Today, the Villa Borghese is a museum, one of the most visited in Italy. The gardens that Scipione planted on the Pincian Hill are a public park, a place where the children of Rome play beneath the cypresses he set in the earth. The galleries that Bernini designed are filled with the paintings and sculptures that Scipione gathered, their walls echoing with the footsteps of visitors from across the world. And in a quiet corner of the museum, in a room that was once the private apartment of the cardinal nephew, there stands a bust carved from marble so white and so fine that it seems to glow from within. It is the face of Scipione Borghese, the man who built a dynasty on the hunger for eternity, rendered by the hand of the artist who understood that hunger better than any other. The face looks out upon the visitors who pass through the galleries, and it asks a question that has no answer. Was it worth it? The churches that lost their masterpieces, the families that were stripped of their heirlooms, the artists who were bent to the will of a patron who saw art as a tool of ambition, these things cannot be undone. The collection that Scipione built is a monument to his hunger, but it is also a monument to the cost of that hunger. Every painting in the Villa Borghese has a story of loss attached to it, a memory of the place it was taken from, the hands that once held it, the prayers that were offered before it. But the collection is also something else. It is a gift. The visitors who stand before Caravaggio's entombment, who trace the line of Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, who marvel at the ancient marbles that Scipione excavated from the ruins of Rome, these visitors are receiving something that the cardinal nephew could not have imagined. They are receiving beauty. They are receiving the accumulated vision of a man who understood that art was the only immortality worth having. And they are receiving it not as a possession, but as a gift, freely given, without the strings of patronage or the weight of obligation. Scipione Borghese wanted to own eternity. He built a villa, gathered a collection, patronized an artist, and imagined that his name would live forever in the marble he carved and the paintings he seized. In a sense, he was right. The name Borghese is still spoken in Rome, still written in the guidebooks, still associated with the villa on the Pincian Hill and the art it contains. But the eternity that Scipione bought was not the eternity he imagined. It is not the eternity of power, of dynasties, of families that shape the destinies of nations. It is the eternity of beauty, of art, of the things that outlast the hands that made them and the eyes that see them. The man from Siena, the law professor who dreamed of papal power, the cardinal who waited decades for his chance, the nephew who seized everything he could reach, they are all gone. The popes they served, the enemies they crushed, the alliances they forged, these are the stuff of history books, read by scholars and forgotten by the world. But the villa remains, the gardens remain, the paintings and the sculptures remain. And in the quiet of a Roman afternoon, when the light falls through the windows of the Villa Borghese and touches the marble face of the man who built it, something remains that is not history. It is the hunger for eternity, the hunger that drives men to build what they cannot keep, to create what they cannot own, to leave behind what they cannot take with them. Scipione Borghese did not own eternity, but for a moment, standing in the galleries he filled with beauty, walking through the gardens he planted on the Pincian Hill, looking at the face he had carved in stone, he came as close as any mortal can. And the visitors who walk those galleries today, who sit in those gardens, who look at that face, are the heirs of his hunger. They are the ones for whom the art was gathered. They are the ones who receive what Scipione could not keep. They are the ones who, for a moment, share in the eternity that the man from Siena bought with his ambition, his ruthlessness, and his love of beauty. The Roman sun that falls upon the Villa Borghese in the autumn of 1803 is the same sun that warmed Scipione's gardens 2 centuries before, but the light falls upon a different world. Napoleon's armies have swept across Italy. The Pope is a prisoner in his own palace, and the old order that the Borghese served for 200 years is crumbling into dust. In the gardens that Scipione planted, a woman walks alone, her gown of white muslin trailing through the fallen leaves, her face turned toward the villa that has been her home for only a few months. She is Pauline Bonaparte, the sister of the man who has remade Europe, and she has come to the Borghese as a bride, bringing with her the glamour and the danger of the French imperial court. The marriage that brought Pauline to Rome was a transaction, like so many Borghese marriages before it. Camillo Borghese, the head of the family, needed a connection to the new power that was reshaping Italy. Napoleon needed a Roman prince to marry his sister, a way to bind the old aristocracy to his new empire. The bride and groom met for the first time on their wedding day, and the reports that survive suggest that neither was pleased with what they saw. Camillo was a reserved man, raised in the traditions of Roman nobility, uncomfortable with the brashness and the ambition of the Bonaparte clan. Pauline was a creature of the Parisian salons, a woman who had learned from her brother that power was for taking, not for inheriting. She found Rome provincial, the Borghese dull, and her husband a bore. But she understood the value of what she had married into. The Villa Borghese, with its gardens and its galleries, its Berninis and its Caravaggios, was a prize that even the Empress Josephine might envy. Pauline set about making it her own, redecorating the apartments in the French style, filling the rooms with the silks and the furniture that she had brought from Paris. She opened the villa to the society of Rome, transforming it from a private collection into a social center, a place where the French officers who occupied the city could mingle with the Roman nobility who had submitted to their rule. The Borghese princes who had preceded her had maintained the villa as a monument to their family's greatness. Pauline Borghese, for she took her husband's name, as the marriage contract required, treated it as a stage, a setting for her own performance of power. The performance was not without its cost. The Roman nobility, who had lost their privileges and their influence to the French occupiers, resented the woman who seemed to embody everything they had lost. The clergy, who saw in Napoleon the Antichrist, whispered that the Borghese had sold their souls for a marriage to the devil's sister. And Camillo, who had hoped that his marriage would restore his family's political fortunes, found himself eclipsed by his wife, his name attached to her scandals, his authority undermined by her independence. The bust that Bernini had carved of Scipione, which had watched over the villa for nearly 2 centuries, seemed to look upon the scene with an expression that was not quite approval. The years of French occupation were years of transformation for the Borghese. The family that had built its power on the papacy learned to navigate a world where the Pope was a prisoner and the Church was an instrument of state. They served Napoleon as they had served the popes, administering the territories he conquered, collecting the taxes he demanded, providing the legitimacy that a new empire needed to govern an ancient land. They prospered under the French, their estates protected, their privileges expanded, their position in Roman society secured by their connection to the imperial family. But the prosperity came at a cost that would be felt for generations. The Borghese had become collaborators, and in the Italy that would emerge after Napoleon's fall, collaboration was a stain that could not be washed away. When Napoleon fell in 1814, the Borghese faced the reckoning that they had dreaded for a decade. The Pope returned to Rome, the old order was restored, and the families who had served the French found themselves under suspicion. The Borghese, who had married the sister of the enemy, who had administered the territories of the occupier, who had profited from the humiliation of the Church, were in a dangerous position. They lost their offices, their privileges, their influence at the papal court. Camillo, who had never been comfortable with the role that his marriage had forced upon him, retreated to his estates, leaving Rome to the families who had remained loyal to the Pope. But the Borghese still had something that no other family had. They still had the villa on the Pincian Hill. They still had the collection that Scipione had gathered. And in the years that followed the Restoration, as the papacy rebuilt its authority and Rome returned to its role as the capital of Christendom, the Villa Borghese became more important to the family than ever. It was their refuge, their identity, their claim to a place in the city that had turned against them. The princes who followed Camillo devoted themselves to the villa, maintaining its gardens, preserving its galleries, opening it to the visitors who came to Rome from across Europe. They could not shape the politics of the city as Scipione had done. They could not command the armies of the church or control the levers of papal patronage, but they could open the doors of the villa to the scholars and the artists, the travelers and the pilgrims who came to see the treasures that their family had assembled. The 19th century was a century of decline for the Borghese as a political force, but it was a century of transformation for the villa. The gardens that Scipione had planted became a public park, a place where the people of Rome could walk beneath the cypresses and sit beside the fountains that had once been reserved for the pleasure of the Borghese alone. The galleries that had been private became a museum, open to anyone who could pay the modest admission fee. The collection that Scipione had gathered as a monument to his family's greatness became a treasure that belonged to the city, a source of pride for Romans who had never heard the name of the man who had assembled it. The transformation was not without its tensions. The Borghese princes who presided over the villa in these years were men caught between two worlds. They were aristocrats in an age of democracy, princes in a city that was becoming a nation, patrons in a world where art was increasingly the property of the public rather than the private collector. They maintained the villa and its collections with a devotion that their ancestors would have recognized, but they did so knowing that the world they were preserving was a world that was passing away. The rituals of papal Rome, the ceremonies that had given meaning to the lives of their ancestors, were becoming history. The power that Scipione had wielded, the influence that had made the Borghese one of the great families of Europe, was becoming memory. In the gardens of the villa, the cypresses that Scipione had planted grew taller with each passing decade. The fountains that he had built continued to toss their water into the Roman air, indifferent to the changes that had transformed the city around them. The bust that Bernini had carved looked out upon visitors who had never heard of the man whose face it bore, who came to see the art and not the patron, who walked through the galleries without knowing the stories of loss and acquisition that had filled them. And in the Palazzo Borghese, in the apartments that had once been the center of Roman power, the princes who bore the family name lived lives that their ancestors would have found unrecognizable. They were not the masters of Rome, they were its guests. The final act of the Borghese as a dynastic power came in 1902, when the family sold the Villa Borghese and its contents to the Italian state. The decision was not made lightly. The princes who negotiated the sale understood what they were giving up. The villa was not merely a building, it was the monument that Scipione had built to his family's greatness, the repository of the art that he had gathered to make the Borghese name immortal. To sell it was to admit that the dynasty that had once reached for the throne of St. Peter was no longer a dynasty, that the power that had made them princes of Rome was gone, that the only thing that remained was the art that their ancestors had collected. But the sale was also a liberation. For 3 centuries, the Borghese had been the custodians of a collection that was too valuable to be private, too important to be hidden. They had maintained it at enormous cost, preserving the paintings and the sculptures that Scipione had gathered, opening the galleries to the visitors who came to Rome from across the world. Now, the burden would be lifted. The Italian state, which had inherited the mantle of Rome's greatness, would preserve what the Borghese had created. The villa would become a public museum, its gardens a public park, its treasures the property of the people who had always been their true owners. When the papers were signed, when the keys were handed over, when the Borghese princes walked out of the villa for the last time as its owners, they left behind something that Scipione could not have imagined. They left behind a legacy that was not about power or wealth or the glory of a single family. They left behind a gift to the city that had made them, a treasure that belonged to Rome as surely as the Colosseum and the Pantheon, a monument to the hunger for beauty that had driven a man from Siena to reach for eternity. The sale of the Villa Borghese to the Italian state in 1902 marked the end of an era, but it did not mark the end of the Borghese. The family continued, its princes living in the Palazzo Borghese in the heart of Rome, its name still spoken with the respect that 3 centuries of history commanded. But something had changed. The collection that had defined them, that had given them purpose and identity, that had been the monument to their greatness, was no longer theirs. It belonged to the nation, to the public, to the tourists who would walk through the galleries that Scipione had built and marvel at the art that he had gathered. The Borghese had become a family without a mission, a dynasty without a destiny. The 20th century was not kind to the great Roman families. The rise of fascism, the trauma of 2 world wars, the transformation of Italy from a monarchy to a republic, these forces swept away the world that the Borghese had inhabited for centuries. The Palazzo Borghese, which had once been the center of Roman power, became a relic, its grand salons echoing with the footsteps of visitors who came to admire its architecture rather than the family who lived within its walls. The princes who bore the Borghese name in these years were men of diminished circumstances, their fortunes eroded by inflation and taxation, their influence reduced to the fading prestige of a name that had once commanded the armies of the church. And yet something remained. The Villa Borghese, now a public museum and park, continued to draw visitors from across the world. The gardens that Scipione had planted, the fountains that he had built, the cypresses that he had set in the earth, these remained, preserved by the Italian state as a monument to the city's greatness. The art that he had gathered, the Caravaggio and the Raphael, the Bernini and the Domenichino, hung on the walls that he had built, visited by millions who came to Rome to see the treasures that one man's hunger had assembled. The Borghese name was no longer attached to power or wealth or political influence. It was attached to beauty, and in a world that had little use for princes, beauty was a currency that still held its value. The transformation of the Borghese from a dynastic power to a cultural legacy was completed in the years after the Second World War. The family that had once controlled the papal treasury, that had commanded the armies of the papal states, that had shaped the politics of Europe from the shadow of the Vatican, became a family of scholars and patrons, their energies devoted not to the acquisition of power, but to the preservation of the past. They maintained the archives that recorded their history, supported the institutions that preserved the art they had collected, and served as the custodians of a memory that was becoming increasingly distant. In the Palazzo Borghese, which the family still occupied, the rooms that had once been the center of papal politics became galleries for the art that remained in private hands. The princes who lived there were no longer the masters of Rome. They were its residents, their lives shaped by the same forces that shaped the lives of the shopkeepers and the bureaucrats who lived in the streets around them. But they carried with them something that the shopkeepers and the bureaucrats did not possess. They carried the memory of a time when one family had reached for the throne of St. Peter and had come close enough to touch it. They carried the awareness that the villa on the Pincian Hill, with its gardens and its galleries, was a monument not only to Scipioni's hunger, but to the hunger of a family that had refused to accept the limits that birth and circumstance had placed upon them. The question that Scipione had asked himself in the final years of his life, what happens to a dynasty when the hunger that built it is gone, found its answer in the 20th century. The hunger was gone. The Borghese no longer reached for the throne of St. Peter, no longer dreamed of controlling the papal treasury, no longer imagined that they could shape the destiny of Europe from the palaces they had built. They had become something that Scipione could not have imagined. They had become a memory, a story, a chapter in the history of a city that had seen families rise and fall for 2,000 years. But the memory was not a small thing. In a city where every stone carried the weight of history, the memory of the Borghese was carved into the marble of the villa, into the paintings that hung on its walls, into the gardens that its founder had planted. The tourists who walked through the galleries, who sat beside the fountains, who looked up at the cypresses that Scipione had set in the earth, were carrying that memory with them, even if they did not know the name of the man who had created it. They were participating in the eternity that Scipione had sought, the eternity of beauty that outlasts the hands that make it and the eyes that see it. In the final decades of the 20th century, the Borghese family made one last contribution to the city that had been their home for 400 years. They opened the archives that recorded their history, allowing scholars to study the documents that told the story of their rise and fall. They donated the art that remained in private hands to the museums that would preserve it. They published the letters and the diaries that chronicled the lives of their ancestors, allowing the world to see the men and women who had built the dynasty that Scipione had founded. It was an act of surrender, a final acknowledgement that the family was no longer a power in the world. But it was also an act of generosity, a gift to the city that had made them, a recognition that the story they had lived was a story that belonged to Rome as much as it belonged to them. The bust that Bernini had carved of Scipione Borghese still stands in the Villa Borghese, in a quiet corner of the museum where the light falls upon it in the late afternoon. The face that Bernini carved is the face of a man who wanted to own eternity, who built a villa and gathered a collection and patronized an artist to make his name immortal. The tourists who pass through the galleries do not know the story of the face they see. They do not know about the paintings taken from altars, the sculptures seized from noble families, the fortunes accumulated through the offices of an uncle who wore the papal tiara. They see only the marble face, the work of a master sculptor, the image of a man who lived 400 years ago and whose name is written in the guidebooks they carry. But the face sees them. The marble eyes that Bernini carved look out upon the visitors who come to the villa, and they see something that Scipione could not have imagined. They see a world where the Borghese are no longer princes, where the papacy is no longer the center of European power, where the art that was gathered for the glory of one family has become the property of all. They see a world where the hunger that drove Scipione to seize and to build and to create has been transformed into something else. The hunger of millions who come to Rome to stand before the beauty that one man assembled, to feel for a moment the awe that Scipione felt when he walked through his galleries, to participate in the eternity that he sought. The bust does not speak, it cannot, but if it could, it might say what Scipione said in the final years of his life, when he stood before the marble face that Bernini had carved and wondered what the world would make of him. It might say, "I did not own eternity, but I built something that outlasted me. I gathered something that could not be destroyed. I created something that the world would not forget, and that, perhaps, is enough." The Palazzo Borghese, which had been the family's Roman residence since the days of Paul V, still stands on the Via Rapetta, its facade looking out upon the Tiber with the same expression of aristocratic indifference that it had worn for 4 centuries. But the family that lives within its walls in the autumn of 2024 is not the family that Scipione built. The princes who once commanded the armies of the church now live quiet lives, their names appearing in society columns rather than diplomatic dispatches, their influence measured in the preservation of archives rather than the control of papal policy. The apartments that once housed the cardinal nephew and his retinue of secretaries and servants are now divided into private residences, their grand salons converted to living rooms, their frescoed ceilings looking down upon the ordinary lives of the family that remain. In one of these apartments, a portrait hangs above a fireplace that has not been lit in years. It is a painting from the 17th century, a work by an artist whose name has been forgotten, depicting a man who was once the head of the Borghese family. He wears the robes of a cardinal, though he was never elevated to the purple, and his hand rests upon a globe that represents the world he hoped to command. The portrait is not a great work of art. It does not hang in the Villa Borghese, does not draw the crowds that gather before the Caravaggio and the Bernini, but it hangs in the home of his descendant, a woman in her 70s who bears the Borghese name and carries the memory of what her family once was. She looks at the portrait each morning when she drinks her coffee, and she wonders what the man in the painting would think of the world she inhabits. She does not live in the past. She has a smartphone, a car, a television that brings the news of the world into her apartment each evening. She reads the newspapers that report on the wars and the elections, the economic crises, and the cultural transformations that shape the Italy of the 21st century. She has friends who are not aristocrats, neighbors who are not princes, a life that would be recognizable to any Roman woman of her age and her class. But she also has something that her neighbors do not possess. She has the memory of a family that once reached for the throne of St. Peter, that once controlled the treasury of the church, that once built a villa on the Pincian Hill and filled it with the most extraordinary collection of art ever assembled by a single individual. The memory is not a burden. It is not the weight that Scipione feared it would become, the obligation that would crush the generations that followed him. It is something else. It is a story that she carries with her, a story that she tells to her grandchildren when they come to visit, a story that connects her to the past in a way that no photograph or document can capture. She tells them about Marcantonio, the law professor who dreamed of papal power and sold his lands to buy a cardinal's hat for his son. She tells them about Camillo, who waited decades for his chance and finally ascended to the throne of St. Peter as Paul V, She tells them about Scipione, the orphan nephew who became the richest man in Rome, who seized Caravaggio from its altar and built a villa on the Pincian Hill, who gathered around himself the greatest artists of his age and made the Borghese name synonymous with beauty and power. And she tells them about the villa that Scipione built, the villa that her family gave to the city of Rome in 1902, the villa that is now a museum where tourists from across the world come to see the art that her ancestors collected. She takes her grandchildren to the Villa Borghese on Sundays, when the weather is fine and the gardens are full of Romans who come to walk beneath the cypresses and sit beside the fountain. She walks with them through the galleries, pointing out the Caravaggio and the Raphael, the Bernini and the Domenichino, the ancient marbles that Scipione excavated from the ruins of Rome. She watches as her grandchildren stand before the bust that Bernini carved of Scipione Borghese, their faces reflecting the same wonder that visitors have felt for 4 centuries. And she wonders, as she has wondered 1,000 times, what Scipione would think if he could see them. Would he be pleased that his collection had become the property of the public, that the art he had gathered for the glory of his family was now enjoyed by millions who did not know his name? Or would he be dismayed that the dynasty he had built had faded into memory, that the Borghese were no longer princes of the church, but ordinary people living ordinary lives, their greatness reduced to the pages of history books and the labels in a museum? The question has no answer. Scipione Borghese has been dead for nearly 400 years. The face that Bernini carved looks out upon the world with an expression that cannot be read, a face that has seen empires rise and fall, popes come and go, families flourish and fade. But perhaps the answer lies not in the face of the man who built the villa, but in the villa itself. The gardens that Scipione planted are still there, the cypresses that he set in the earth, now towering above the paths that he laid out. The fountains that he built still toss their water into the Roman air, their music a constant presence in the lives of the Romans who walk through the park each day. The galleries that he filled with beauty are still filled with beauty, the paintings and sculptures that he gathered still inspiring the same awe that they inspired when they were first unveiled. The villa that Scipione built as a monument to his family's greatness has become something larger than his family. It has become a monument to the city that made him, to the hunger for beauty that has driven men and women for millennia, to the eternal desire to create something that will outlast the hands that make it. In the Palazzo Borghese, on the Via Ripetta, the woman who bears the family name finishes her coffee and rises from her chair. She looks once more at the portrait of her ancestor, the cardinal who never was, the man whose hand rests upon a globe that represents the world he hoped to command. She smiles, not because the portrait is beautiful, it is not, but because it connects her to something larger than herself. It connects her to the story of a family that refused to accept the limits that birth and circumstance had placed upon them, that reached for the throne of St. Peter and built a villa on the Pincian Hill, that gathered around themselves the most extraordinary collection of art ever assembled by a single individual. The family is no longer power in the world. The throne they reached for is occupied by another, but the villa remains, the gardens remain, the art remain. And in the quiet of a Roman afternoon, when the light falls through the windows of the Villa Borghese and touches the marble face of the man who built it, the story continues. It continues in the footsteps of the tourists who walk through the galleries, in the laughter of the children who play in the gardens, in the memory of a woman who drinks her coffee beneath the portrait of an ancestor who dreamed of commanding the world. It continues in the cypresses that Scipione planted, the fountains that he built, the art that he gathered. It continues because the hunger that drove Scipione Borghese to reach for eternity is the same hunger that drives every human heart, the desire to create something that will outlast us, to leave behind something that will speak to the generations that follow, to build a monument that will stand when we are gone. The Borghese did not own eternity, no family does, but they built something that outlasted them. They gathered something that could not be destroyed. They created something that the world has not forgotten. And in the gardens of the villa on the Pincian Hill, beneath the cypresses that Scipione planted, beside the fountains that he built, the story of their quest for papal power becomes something else. It becomes the story of a family that learned, in the end, that the only power worth having is the power to create beauty, and that the only eternity worth seeking is the eternity that art provides. The light that falls upon the Villa Borghese on a spring morning in 2026 is the same light that fell upon Scipione's gardens 4 centuries ago, but the world that receives it has changed beyond recognition. The cypresses that he planted have grown into giants. their dark forms cutting the sky like the spires of a cathedral. The fountains he built still toss their water into the air, their music mingling with the voices of children who race along the paths, their laughter echoing where cardinals once walked in whispered conference. The villa itself stands at the heart of the park, its facade simple and severe, a deliberate contrast to the ornate palaces of the Roman nobility. But the facade is a mask. Behind it lies something that Scipione Borghese could not have imagined. A public museum, its galleries filled with the art he gathered, its rooms echoing with the footsteps of visitors from across the world. The visitors come in thousands, streaming through the entrance each morning, their cameras raised, their guidebooks open, their faces turned toward the masterpieces that hang on the walls. They come from Tokyo and Sao Paulo, from Berlin and New York, from the villages of India and the cities of China. They come because the Villa Borghese is one of the great museums of the world, because the art it contains is among the most beautiful ever created, because the name Borghese is written in every guidebook to Rome. They do not know the story of the man who built the villa. They do not know about the paintings taken from altars, the sculptures seized from noble families, the fortunes accumulated through the offices of a pope. They know only that the art is here, that it is beautiful, that they have traveled thousands of miles to stand before it. And stand before it they do. In the gallery that contains Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, a crowd gathers each day, their faces reflecting the wonder that visitors have felt since the sculpture was unveiled in 1624. The marble seems to breathe, to move, to live. Daphne's fingers are already becoming leaves, her toes rooting into the earth, her mouth open in a cry that the marble cannot voice. Apollo's hand presses against her side, his fingers sinking into the flesh that is transforming beneath his touch. The visitors stare, their cameras forgotten for a moment, their minds struggling to comprehend how a man with a chisel could make stone express so much. They do not know that Bernini carved this work for Scipione Borghese, that the cardinal nephew paid for it with gold that had been taken from the papal treasury, that the sculpture was intended not as a gift to the world, but as a monument to the family that commissioned it. They see only the beauty, and in that seeing, they participate in the eternity that Scipione sought. In the room that contains Caravaggio's entombment, the atmosphere is different. The painting is dark, its figures emerging from shadow with a power that still shocks after 4 centuries. Christ's body is heavy, his flesh the color of cold marble, his mother's face contorted with a grief that seems too raw for the walls of a museum. The visitors who stand before it speak in whispers as if they are in a church. Some of them cross themselves, a gesture that Caravaggio would have understood, a recognition that the painting was made for worship, not for viewing. They do not know that this painting was taken from its altar in the Chiesa Nuova, that Scipione Borghese used the machinery of the papal treasury to seize it, that the Oratorian priests who commissioned it wept when it was carried away. They see only the power, the grief, the beauty, and in that seeing, they receive what Scipione could not keep. In the gallery of ancient marbles, the visitors walk among the gods and heroes of Rome, their faces reflecting the same awe that the ancients felt when they carved these figures from the stone of the empire. A young woman stands before a bust of the Emperor Hadrian, her hand reaching out as if to touch the marble that has survived for nearly 2,000 years. A father lifts his daughter so she can see a relief of Apollo's chariot, the horses frozen in mid-gallop, their manes tossed back by a wind that has not blown for millennia. They do not know that these marbles were excavated from the ruins of Rome by Scipioni's agents, that they were taken from the villas of emperors and the temples of forgotten gods, that they were gathered to decorate the gardens of a cardinal who wanted to surround himself with the glory of the ancient world. They see only the history, the beauty, the weight of the past pressing against the present. The villa itself is a character in this story, its rooms arranged as Scipione arranged them, its walls painted in the colors he chose, its spaces designed to display the art he gathered. The architects who transformed the old vineyard into a palace understood that the building was not merely a container for the collection. It was part of the collection, a work of art in its own right, a frame that enhanced the beauty of the paintings and sculptures it contained. The visitors who walk through its galleries are walking through the mind of Scipione Borghese, through the vision of a man who wanted to create a space where beauty could be experienced in its fullest intensity. They do not know that they are walking through a prison as well as a palace, through the gilded cage that Scipione built for himself and for the generations that followed him. But the villa is not only a museum, it is also a park, and the park is open to the people of Rome in a way that the museum is not. On a spring morning, the gardens that Scipione planted are filled with Romans who come to walk, to run, to sit beside the fountains, to read beneath the cypresses. They do not pay admission. They do not need guidebooks. They come because the Villa Borghese is their park, a refuge from the noise and the traffic of the modern city, a place where the beauty that Scipione created has become part of their daily lives. The children who race along the paths do not know the name of the man who planted the trees they run beneath. The lovers who sit beside the fountains do not know that the water they watch was set in motion by a cardinal who wanted to impress his guests. The old men who play chess on the benches beneath the cypresses do not know that the shade that shelters them was planted by a man who wanted to own eternity. And yet they are the heirs of Scipione Borghese in a way that his own descendants could never be. They are the ones for whom the villa was built, the ones for whom the gardens were planted, the ones who receive what Scipione could not keep. The art in the galleries belongs to them, not as property but as inheritance. The beauty that Scipione gathered belongs to them, not as possession but as gift. The villa that he built, as a monument to his family's greatness, has become a monument to the city that made him, to the people who have walked through his gardens for 4 centuries, to the hunger for beauty that drives every human heart. In a quiet corner of the museum, away from the crowds that gather before the Caravaggio and the Bernini, there is a room that few visitors find. It is a small room, its walls painted a deep red, its windows looking out upon the gardens that Scipione planted. In this room, there is a single work of art, the bust that Bernini carved of Scipione Borghese. The face that Bernini carved is the face of a man who wanted to own eternity, who built a villa and gathered a collection and patronized an artist to make his name immortal. The marble eyes look out upon the visitors who pass through the room, and they see something that Scipione could not have imagined. They see a world where the Borghese are no longer princes, where the papacy is no longer the center of European power, where the art that was gathered for the glory of one family has become the property of all. They see a world where the hunger that drove Scipione to seize and to build and to create has been transformed into something else. The hunger of millions who come to Rome to stand before the beauty that one man assembled. The room is quiet. The crowds that press against the barriers before the Caravaggio do not come here. The guides who lecture on Bernini's technique do not lead their groups through this door. The visitors who find this room find it by accident, drawn by a curiosity that their guidebooks do not satisfy. They stand before the marble face, and they wonder who the man was, what he did, why his face was carved in stone. They read the label on the wall, the brief description that tells them Scipione Borghese was a cardinal, a patron of the arts, the founder of the collection they have come to see. They do not learn about the paintings taken from altars, the sculptures seized from noble families, the fortunes accumulated through the offices of a pope. They do not learn about the hunger that drove him, the ambition that consumed him, the cost of the beauty they have come to see. But the face tells them something that the label cannot. It tells them that the man who built this villa was a man like them, a man who wanted something that he could not have, a man who reached for something that he could not hold. It tells them that the beauty they have come to see was born of hunger, that the art that fills these galleries was gathered by a man who wanted to own eternity and could not. It tells them that the prison that Scipione built for himself, the prison of beauty, of ambition, of the hunger that can never be satisfied, is a prison that every human heart knows. And then they leave. They walk out of the room, down the corridor, past the Caravaggio and the Bernini, through the doors of the villa and into the gardens that Scipione planted. They walk beneath the cypresses, past the fountains, along the paths that Scipione laid out. They do not know that they are walking through the mind of a man who died 400 years ago, through the vision of a man who wanted to create something that would outlast him. They do not know that they are the heirs of his hunger, the ones for whom the beauty was gathered, the ones who receive what he could not keep. But the gardens know. The cypresses that Scipione planted have stood for 4 centuries, watching the generations pass beneath their branches. The fountains that he built have tossed their water into the Roman air for 4 centuries, their music a constant presence in the lives of the city. The villa that he built has been a museum for more than a century, its galleries filled with visitors who come to see the beauty that one man's hunger assembled. And in a quiet corner of the museum, in a room that few visitors find, the face that Bernini carved looks out upon the world with an expression that has not changed in 400 years. It is the expression of a man who wanted to own eternity, who built a villa and gathered a collection and patronized an artist to make his name immortal. It is the expression of a man who learned, in the end, that the only eternity worth having is the eternity that beauty provides. The sun that sets over Rome on this spring evening is the same sun that set over the city when Scipione Borghese stood at the window of his villa and watched the light move across the domes and the rooftops, the cypresses and the fountains, the city he had tried to own. The light is golden now, the hour that the Romans call il tramonto, when the stones of the city seem to glow from within and the shadows lengthen across the gardens of the Pincian Hill. The visitors who crowded the galleries have gone, their cameras packed away, their guidebooks closed, their flights home awaiting them in the morning. The museum is closed, its doors locked, its galleries empty, but the park remains open, and the Romans come out in the cool of the evening to walk beneath the cypresses that Scipione planted, to sit beside the fountains that he built, to let the peace of the gardens wash over them after the noise and the hurry of the day. An old man sits on a bench near the pond where the water lilies float, their white blossoms catching the last of the light. He comes here every evening when the weather is fine, a habit he has kept for 30 years, ever since he retired from his work as a historian at the University of Rome. He knows the gardens as well as any living person, knows the names of the trees and the dates of the fountains, knows the history of the villa that stands at the heart of the park. He has spent his life studying the Borghese, reading their letters and their diaries, tracing the rise and fall of the family that built this place. He knows about Marcantonio, the law professor who dreamed of papal power and sold his lands to buy a cardinal's hat for his son. He knows about Camillo, who waited decades for his chance and finally ascended to the throne of St. Peter, as Paul V. He knows about Scipione, the orphaned nephew who became the richest man in Rome, who seized Caravaggio from its altar and built a villa on the Pincian Hill, who gathered around himself the greatest artists of his age and made the Borghese name synonymous with beauty and power. He knows, too, about the cost. He knows about the paintings taken from churches, the sculptures seized from noble families, the fortunes accumulated through the offices of a pope. He knows about the families who lost their heirlooms, the priests who wept when their altars were stripped, the artists who were bent to the will of a patron who saw art not as an expression of the human spirit, but as a tool of dynastic ambition. He knows that the beauty that fills the villa was paid for with cruelty, that the gardens that give him peace were planted on ground that was taken from others, that the dynasty that built this place was built on the suffering of those who could not resist it. And yet, as he sits on his bench and watches the light fade from the water, he does not feel the anger that he felt when he was young, the outrage that drove him to write his first book about the Borghese, the book that exposed the crimes and the cruelties that lay beneath the beauty of the villa. The anger is gone now, replaced by something that he does not have a name for. It is not forgiveness. He does not believe that the past can be forgiven, that the dead can be absolved of the harm they did. It is not acceptance. He does not believe that the cruelty that built this place was justified by the beauty it produced. It is something else. It is the recognition that the past is past, that the men and women who lived it are gone, that the only thing that remains is what they left behind. And what they left behind is this: the cypresses that Scipione planted, the fountains that he built, the art that he gathered, the gardens that give peace to the people of Rome. A young woman walks past his bench, her hand in the hand of a child, her face turned toward the villa that glows in the last of the light. She does not know the history of this place. She does not know about the paintings taken from altars, the sculptures seized from noble families, the fortunes accumulated through the offices of a pope. She knows only that this is her park, the place where she comes to walk with her daughter when the day is done, the place where the cypresses rise against the sky and the fountains toss their water into the air, the place where she can forget for a moment the noise and the hurry of the city. She does not know that she is walking through the mind of a man who died 400 years ago, through the vision of a man who wanted to create something that would outlast him. She does not know that she is the heir of his hunger, the one for whom the beauty was gathered, the one who receives what he could not keep. But the old man knows. He watches her pass, and he thinks about the generations who have walked these paths, who have sat beside these fountains, who have looked up at these cypresses. He thinks about the pilgrims who came to Rome in the 17th century, seeking the blessings of the Pope, and who walked through these gardens as a respite from the crowds and the heat. He thinks about the travelers of the 18th century, the young men from England and Germany and France who came to complete their education and who wrote in their journals about the wonders of the Villa Borghese. He thinks about the Romans of the 19th century, who came to these gardens when they became a public park, who walked here on Sundays in their finest clothes, who courted their sweethearts beneath the cypresses that Scipione planted. He thinks about the visitors of the 20th century, who came from across the world to see the art that one man's hunger had assembled, and who left behind something of themselves in the gardens they walked through. And he thinks about the man who built this place, the man whose face Bernini carved in marble, the man who wanted to own eternity. He thinks about Camillo Borghese, standing at the window of his villa, watching the light move across the city he had tried to own. He thinks about the hunger that drove him, the ambition that consumed him, the cost of the beauty he created. He thinks about the question that Scipione asked himself in the final years of his life. What happens to a dynasty when the hunger that built it is gone? And he thinks he knows the answer now, after a lifetime of studying the Borghese, after 30 years of sitting on this bench and watching the people of Rome walk through the gardens that Scipione planted. The hunger is not gone, it is transformed. It is the hunger of the visitors who come from across the world to stand before the Caravaggio and the Bernini, to feel for a moment the awe that Scipione felt when he walked through his galleries. It is the hunger of the Romans who come to these gardens each evening, to walk beneath the cypresses and sit beside the fountains, to let the peace of this place wash over them after the noise and the hurry of the day. It is the hunger of the old man on the bench, who has spent his life trying to understand the men and women who built this place, who reads their letters and their diaries and wonders what they would think if they could see what their hunger has become. The sun has set. The light that falls upon the Villa Borghese is no longer golden but grey, the twilight that comes between the day and the night, the hour when the city seems to hold its breath before the darkness comes. The old man rises from his bench and begins the slow walk home, his steps measured, his eyes on the path before him. Behind him, the villa stands against the fading sky, its windows dark, its doors locked, its galleries empty. But the gardens remain, and the cypresses that Scipione planted, and the fountains that he built. And in a quiet room at the heart of the villa, in the darkness that has fallen, the face that Bernini carved looks out upon the night with eyes that see nothing and everything, with an expression that has not changed in 400 years. The Borghese wanted to own eternity. They built a villa and gathered a collection and patronized an artist to make their name immortal. They reached for the throne of St. Peter and came close enough to touch it. They accumulated wealth that would have bought kingdoms and power that would have moved armies. But in the end, the only thing they owned was the hunger that drove them, the hunger that passed from generation to generation, from Marcantonio to Camillo to Scipione, from the princes who came after to the princes who gave the villa to the city. The hunger was their inheritance, their burden, their gift. It was the thing that built the villa and filled it with beauty. It was the thing that outlasted them, that transformed them from princes of the church into a chapter in the history of a city, that turned their quest for papal power into something that no pope could give and no pope could take away. The cypresses that Scipione planted will stand for another 400 years if the world endures. The fountains that he built will toss their water into the Roman air, their music a constant presence in the lives of the city. The art that he gathered will hang on the walls that he built, inspiring awe in the generations that come after. And the visitors who walk through the gardens and the galleries will carry with them something that Scipione could not have imagined. They will carry the beauty that one man's hunger assembled, the beauty that belongs not to the Borghese but to the world, the beauty that is the only eternity worth having. The man from Siena, the law professor who dreamed of papal power, the cardinal who waited decades for his chance, the nephew who seized everything he could reach, they are gone. The papacy that made them has become a shadow of what it was. The power that they wielded has passed to others, but the villa remains, the gardens remain, the art remains. And in the quiet of a Roman evening, when the light falls through the windows of the Villa Borghese and touches the marble face of the man who built it, something remains that is not history. It is the hunger for eternity, the hunger that drives men and women to build what they cannot keep, to create what they cannot own, to leave behind what they cannot take with them. The Borghese did not own eternity, no one does, but for the moment that it takes to stand before a Caravaggio, to walk beneath a cypress, to sit beside a fountain, they come as close as any mortals can. And in that moment, the quest for papal power becomes something else. It becomes the quest for beauty, and the beauty, at least, endures. The Villa Borghese stands on the Pincian Hill, its gardens open to the public, its galleries filled with visitors from across the world. The cypresses that Scipione planted have grown into giants, their dark forms cutting the sky like the spires of a cathedral. The fountains he built still toss their water into the Roman air, their music a constant presence in the lives of the city. And in a quiet room at the heart of the villa, the face that Bernini carved looks out upon the world with an expression that has not changed in 400 years. It is the face of a man who wanted to own eternity, who built a villa and gathered a collection and patronized an artist to make his name immortal. It is the face of a man who learned, in the end, that the only eternity worth having is the eternity that beauty provides. The Borghese reached for the throne of St. Peter and came close enough to touch it. They built a dynasty on the hunger for power and transformed that hunger into something that no pope could give and no pope could take away. They became, in the end, not the masters of Rome but its servants, not the owners of eternity but its custodians. And in the gardens that Scipione planted, beneath the cypresses that he set in the earth, beside the fountains that he built, the story of their quest continues, in the footsteps of the visitors who walk through the galleries, in the laughter of the children who play in the gardens, in the memory of a family that dared to reach for the stars and found, in the end, that the stars were not theirs to hold, but the reaching that was theirs. And in the reaching, they gave the world something that no pope could give and no emperor could command. They gave it beauty, and the beauty, at least, endures.